I was very struck when looking at these two stories again, Star and looking at Cthulhu particularly, how both these stories are really global stories. Going back to what you said about the point of view in Cthulhu, we journey through Rhode Island, Louisiana, Greenland, mountains of China, New Zealand, Norway, and the Pacific in one fairly short story. And in the Star, you have this roving sort of camera, roving point of view that looks at a woman who's bereaving and mourning the loss of her child. There's a homeless person wandering through the snow. It covers all of Europe, and then obviously it covers the entire planet, and it goes to South America, and it's a huge global sweep for a very short story. Are these the first writers to do this? It's very cinematic, and it makes me think of, it's a common cliche in sort of disaster movies where you see, the film's set in America, and then you see Big Ben and the same sort of disaster happening in the background, and the province of Egypt, and you see the same disaster in the background. And in the trailer to the new Independence Day, they even sort of make fun of that. And there's a line, I think it's Jeff Goldblum says, "They always go for the landmarks." Is this something which came about at a particular time, because it predates cinema?
Well, I think with my area of expertise, can you all hear me okay with this?
Yeah.
Verne did some of that.
Yeah.
From the Ocean and so on. But Wells certainly went to town on it. And he was very cinematic, as you said. He was very aware of the early experiments in cinema. And you can see it in the War of the Worlds, where he kind of pans back and you look down on London. Sometimes he just justifies it as a balloon instead of London that day would have seen the crowds splashes with black smoke from the Martians have been positive. So he does use that very visual technique. Later, there's a book called Mr. Britling Sees It Through, which is another very good book, very different. It's Wells as a 50-year-old in the middle of World War I. And he's a fictitious father in the book, and he's describing his reaction to the war and the horror. At first he's all for it, for smashing the horror of Germany. Then he's the waste of war and the blood of the youth and so on, very traumatised. But in the middle of that, he talks about, he uses very cinematic techniques. There's one where it's early, just as the war's breaking out, it's a sort of August day, I think. There's a county fair, there's children on merry-go-rounds and things. And then he says it's as if newspaper headlines were burning through this image of troop movements in France and this kind of thing. And a dissolve, basically. So he was maybe describing early experiments and anticipated something. But certainly that sort of roving eye point of view of cinema must have really brought to imagination twice.
Because Dickens does it a little bit as well.
Absolutely will.
Dickens does it in Christmas Carol, where the ghost goes over the Christmas present. There's an aspect or a quality to HP Lovecraft's writing, which is kind of perhaps unique to him, and he's always fascinating in kind of bringing disciplines back together. And there's in Cthulhu, I mean, the opening paragraph sort of reads, just to quote a couple of bits, the most merciful thing in the world, I think, is the inability of the human mind to correlate its contents. Someday, the piecing together dissociated knowledge will open up such terrifying vistas of reality and of our frightful position therein that we shall either go mad from the revelation or flee from the deadly light into the peace and safety of a new dark age. He's fascinated with bringing together, piecing together, as he says, dissociated knowledge, and he does this not only with regard to science fiction and horror as genres he's bringing them together, but within his stories he'll cover psychology, geology, he loves good earthquake, astronomy. The earthquake's always connected to space, and as it is in the Star, I'm not entirely sure how those two things always relate. There's always an earthquake whenever, or some volcanoes exploding whenever a star comes near. anthropology. He's kind of like a massive. He's remixing these disciplines, and I wonder if Ramsey is somebody who's known and worked under his influence for many years. If you think is he kind of an Elizabethan intellect that's slightly out of his time?
Oh, very much.
Or is he kind of like ahead of his time, because now so much science is kind of interdisciplinary. It's breaking the boundaries of specialism.
Well, I would compromise to say it was both, actually. It seems to me. In one sense, he certainly regarded himself as being, a man. He was much preferred to live more than a century earlier. Actually, that was his preferred period. But equally, no, he was very forward-looking in the sense that he would embrace the latest scientific discoveries, which of course were not always, sadly, that sound. Some have been discounted since. Certainly, some of the eugenics that surfaced in his work. But to some extent, the eugenicists too, was he not? But at that time, they were considered to be not the last word, sort of the latest thing. But no, Lovecraft would try and take new discoveries and build upon them. So he was certainly looking both forwards and backwards without doubt. And he certainly did draw upon particularly the structures of what he saw in the field. So, something like the call of cuckoo, or however you want to do it. It certainly derives to some extent from Stoker's Dracula, and the use of documents, and also Arthur Mack of the Great God Pan. But I think Lovecraft refined the process beyond what either writer had done.
That's the documentary sort of element.
Yeah, the use of documents
is so influential, again, in film. It feels like Hollywood disaster films or film generally, horror films and of all different types, are still digesting these techniques, which both Wells in terms of the point of view and Lovecraft in terms of the sort of documentary style. Cinema is still digesting them and still sort of perfecting them, as you say with Blair Witch Project. Just talk about the question of the role of science, Stephen. Going back to H.G. Wells, there's sort of two interpretations of Wells. One, a lot of biographers talk about his grounding in biology, the fact that he wrote lots of popular science books himself. He apparently was desperate to be entered into the Royal Society, appointed a member of the Royal Society, which he never was. And then there's another reading of Wells, which perhaps popularised by Jules Verne, who said he wasn't really that interested in science. There's a quote. Essentially, Jules Verne accused him of using science as like a new magic or a new fantasy to like a Just So story to kind of explore his social ideas. Whether it's the class system with regard to the time machine, or empire and colonialism with regard to War of the Worlds, or man's hubris and hubris of science when it comes to the element of Dr. Thoreau. Verne said, it occurs to me that his Wells stories do not repose on very scientific bases. There is no rapport between his work and mine. I make use of physics, he invents. I go to the moon in a cannonball discharged from a cannon. There is no invention, it's possible. He goes to Mars in an airship, which he constructs out of a metal which does away with the law of gravitation. Ça c'est très joli, but show me this metal, let him produce it. There's this argument that, and it sometimes applies, I know Jeff Ryman applies it to the kind of the history of science fiction. Now, there's two schools. There's the Verne school, which is about real science, hard science, predicting predicting what new technology might be able to do, really engaging with science, and then the Wellsian approach, or what Verne says is the Wellsian approach, which is to use it like a magic wand, or use it as a device to explore other themes. Do you subscribe to that kind of dichotomy?
Well, I think it's it's never as simple as that, is it? That's the real answer. Verne, for instance, I mentioned often a comet. There's another Hector Circle, I think, is the original title in French, where a comet lifts the Earth magically, carved of a kind of spherical blob of part of the Mediterranean, and like a little planetoid, and off they go into the void. And that works out all the gravity and so forth. You know. The density is somehow magically increased. And when they come back to the Earth, I think he originally wanted a huge splattering disaster for his editor, who was very influential over Verne. So no, you've got to let them off. So I think they fly off in balloons and just settle down. It's just nothing. So Verne was quite capable of. Yeah. On the other hand, I mean, yeah, you probably would say in modern terms he was more of a hard essay writer than Romans in terms of sticking to the known. From the Earth to the Moon. Yes, I mean, you know, a few details aside, getting splattered against the base of the shell, the canon view of the world, better than Wells' anti-gravity. And Verne didn't show any life on the moon the way Wells did. You wouldn't speculate that far. Maybe shows the vegetation, I can't remember, but nothing spectacular. But I would say Wells, well, this isn't fair to say either, really. Wells went deep. I think the lesson of science went deep into Wells as a very young man, because he studied under Huxley, who was Darwin's bulldog. So he was the generation after the evolutionists, you know. He was the first to be taught evolution at college. So this bleak, dark, mechanistic view of the universe absolutely convinced him. He rejected religion, on the other hand. He was kind of forcibly confirmed at one point. He had to get a confirmation to be able to teach at some school there, which he deeply resented. He had to study religion or Christianity to do this. He called it grafts and rotting ideas and so on. So I think the basic message of science, that there's a scientific explanation and rationale for the universe and for ourselves, was deeply embedded in him, with all its gruesome side. You know, I mean, really, the War of the Worlds, the clash of biospheres, in a very basic and fundamental way, the bacteria, which have been killing us for 1 billion years, which is why they kill the Martians quicker. You know, we still killed us. You know, it's a gruesome tale. I think he says that Dr. Moreau, which got criticised for its horrific aspects at the time, he said every soul from the universe turns to him with a particularly gruesome grimace, because he sees the really dark side of life. So I think for all the anti-gravity and so forth, I think he got the underlying spirit of the times, late Victorian age, when you were having to shed, really, the relatively comforting illusion that we are creatures of a god, and this awful, really empty, conceivably, idea that we are like machines, really, you know, zombies who have risen from the dirt. I think at a very deep level he got that. So, you know, I mean, there was a great deal of rupture between Verne and Wells, so you can't put that aside. That's a bit like reading out commentaries by an Everton fan of the Liverpool European Cup draft in 1989. You never make allergy to
when you talk about the war worlds and the war's biospheres, it reminds me of Darwin's phrase, you know, the quiet war, which is the quiet war which nature fights all the time. Sorry, I've been hogging questions because I've got so many. I want to throw it out to you guys. I can keep asking questions all night, but I'm sure you guys want to ask some questions yourself. Andy?
So, thank you. I do apologise, I'm going to have to shoot off right after this, but I wanted just to follow up on what Steve said about the last question. That in introducing a collected works with scientific romances in 1936, Wells is desperate to sort of say, I don't do science, I'm trying to get the same plausibility as a gripping dream, and he goes back to sort of Greek romances and things, but he also significantly gets the entire idea of Frankenstein wrong, and it's sort of clear that if you were asked questions when he was actually writing the scientific romances, he would have been much more scientific, I think.
And also, everything with Wells is Wells in scholarship will never end with it, because he wrote so much, he did so much every day of his other life probably, that no one scholar could ever grasp the whole, and he contradicted himself. So that, as you say, when he was producing editions of the scientific romances in the 20s and 30s, he could be quite dismissive. You know, he was on the other side of the barrier from about 1900 when he became much more didactic. He was writing these utopias, you know, trying to make specific political points and so forth, which were probably more well argued as straightforward polemics, but much less gripping as fiction. You know, another big complication, so he was looking back at what jaundiced eye in his own work. However, but another thing going on with Wells, of course, was his physical state. You know, there he is in 1895, 6, 7, when he wrote The War of the Worlds and The Time Machine. Great success, but at the time he seems to be a sense of mortality. He had, what was it, TB, he was exposed to. He'd been badly injured in a football match when he was a teacher briefly. He got kicked in the kidneys by some lads, which invalided him out. And it looked as if his life expectancy, his health was pretty poor, it looked as if his life expectancy was going to be pretty short, even while, you know, his personal success was booming. I mean, you know, it must have been a terrible, as a young man, it must have been a terrible dichotomy of impressions, writing very quickly to get it all out. And that surely colours the early scientific romances, you know, Dr. Monroe and so on. He really was seeing a very dark side of the universe because he thought, you know, the universe was being very harsh on him. So it's not much of a surprise that he gets it kind of all clear about 1900 or so, and then, you know, his mind's clarified and he starts to think sort of, why eugenics is a good thing.
Yeah, would you mind talking a little bit about the short story as form? Why do you think the short story particularly suits science fiction and horror writing, or do you think it particularly suits it at all, or how it informs your sense of writing?
Good question. To be honest, I think they do different things. I think the novels are important, the short story and the horror story and the horror fiction field these days. And I think that the novel has developed very considerably since, I suppose, I'm not saying there were not early great examples of it from Frankenstein on, but when you were to play Frankenstein for science fiction, I don't know most people. Brian Alder certainly does, that's true, yeah. Well, I think we can each of us have a half of it maybe, you know, a stake of it.
You want them each.
Exactly, but you know, Dracula and the Haunting of Hill House and so forth, Iron Legend. But you know, I think really from the 70s onward, when there was the modern golden age of horror, the novel developed very considerably. All of a sudden, really. And yet, you know, some of the greatest work in the field is in the short story, because you know it's very compact. You can, you know, in the most poetic way possible, you can organise everything to a single effect. Whereas the novel is, I think, much more discursive in its effect. But you see, I for myself, I like that. I actually like the fact that a novel will gain its own energy and momentum in ways that a short story, you know, really by definition cannot. But of course, we also have the novella in the middle, and it's often argued that is the perfect form for horror fiction. You know, certainly something, well, oddly enough, some of the ones I was quoting earlier, The White People, The Willows, The Whisper in Darkness, most of Lovecraft's later stories are novellas. Ted Klein, very fine American contemporary writer, so like Steve King's The Mist, you know. And so it's a specific form, and usually, and we keep coming back to Brian Alder this evening, I mean, I remember his argument that a novella should take place within a very short space of time, really, so you have that sort of unity. You can still be saying time, but voice length came out. So, quite honestly, I wouldn't argue in favour of one over the other. I think that they have their merits. I wouldn't be without either of them, certainly not the writer themselves.
No, and I don't go up for science fiction. There are people who say that short fiction, the short story, make a novella is the perfect form for science fiction because of the plausibility thing. You know, you can get away with that outrageous sort of idea for 10 pages before the reader starts thinking, oh my god. And The Time Machine is a novella length, probably said, 100 pages in an early edition. But yeah, but I, you know, I've done plenty of short stories, but my preferred length is the novel, or the novel series, and really explore an idea. Ideally from one change, you know, in the universe as we know it. Maybe with props like spacecraft or whatever, but one big change, one new idea, and then really explore it and see how it works out.
The star is a really, really good example of how you can quickly fly around this roving camera. You can see lots and lots of people's different lives. You can just see it in a glimpse. You get right into a character and then straight out again. And the mathematician, I guess, is Ogilvy. He somehow becomes the centre of that story, and you see him for so little. You see him maybe a first observation. You see him in a couple of lectures. You have this moment where he sort of devastates his students with this fantastic line. Humanity has been in vain, or something. You know, he's devastating. His kids look up and, you know, this isn't usual. This isn't our normal lecture. You get into those worlds and those lives really, really, really quickly, and you don't. In a way, it's kind of. I personally think it's sort of a more purer form of the roving camera, because you don't stick with anybody. And there's a great argument about world building, and we can talk about world building with regard to HP. But there's a line by M. John Harrison about the fact that you can build a world with a single sentence, and H.G. Wells in that story just drops into a life and builds a life in a single sentence and then moves on. And I think it's masterful.
I don't quite agree about that actually.
Okay.
Because I think that's a special case as well. As I said, I think it's a relic of a novel that was never written. Hence, you know, there's so much detail that's kind of crammed in because that's what would be in a novel. I suspect that's just my theory about that. And you can see how in When Worlds Collide. I mean, I went on about how it may have been related to the story. As I recall it, I think it's in the essay, this stuff. One of the scriptwriters on One Worlds Collide had worked on Wells' properties, The Invisible Man or something. So he clearly knew all about Wells. But the story wasn't credited in the movie. Even though you have the same kind of global viewpoints, and particularly there is a kind of master mathematician element in the movie, except it's a differential analyzer in that movie, which is a kind of Meccano version 1950s computer. It's all wheeling pens and clattering leads and everything. It's a fantastic thing in the movie. That's replaced the master mathematician. So I think that's a special case, but it is a good story.
Yep.
Lovecraft, in his earlier stories, like the supernatural elements are more to the fore. So you have ghosts, kind of ghost rats lead me to the cellar, I eat my neighbour, I go mad.
Yes.
And then, or a ghost opens up the tomb, I go in, do whatever, I go mad. And then towards the end of the thing, the science fiction has come to the fore, and you've got, brain in a can, talking spacecrafts. I run off. I go back to my job as a lecturer in the university. I just found out that Cthulhu is real, race from the sea. Oh my goodness! Go back to being an archaeologist or whatever, and or time travel. I go back to being a lecturer. It kind of humanises. So the science fiction elements kind of humanise the protagonists, especially towards the end of things. I think that's a valid point.
Yes, I think so. Yes, I take your point. Although I suppose usually at the end of those stories, there's still a hint that all is not well, and that the duration of the call is it sounds that he's not long for this world because he knows too much, basically. So the lecturer in The Shadow Out of Time is you'll think, I'm sure, that great time travel story, which is Lovecraft. I suppose that's Lovecraft's version of the time machine, really, where your mind has actually been projected into the future, or makes my mind into the past. I'm sorry that I get that right. I won't ruin the story for anybody who's not read it, but it does have one of Lovecraft's most striking confirmatory images at the very end of the story. But has he really survived? And while I take your point, usually the stories don't end on that note, do they? There may be a sense earlier on in the story that this character has to some extent got it back together, as much as he possibly can. but the stories pretty well always end on a note of final revelation and, kind of mental devastation, if you like. Or in the case of Shadow over Innsmouth, of course, you're discovering that you yourself are what you thought was profoundly alien. And that sort of ends on, that does end on very ambiguous note of what you might say is affirmation, I think. It depends on how you read it. It's either helpless, as my partner made it, he's going to swim off to this place under the sea. But I think, I don't know, I've always thought that's the one story of Lovecraft's that really merges one thing that I didn't talk about at all, because we can't cover everything, but as well as the science fiction and the horror, Lovecraft wrote a fair amount of high fantasy, things like the Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath and the Silver Key and so forth, largely influenced by Lord Dunsany. But the end of the Shadow over Innsmouth almost feels as if it has turned from being a horror story into a kind of almost lyrical fantasy. And it's certainly very ambiguous, but I still, it's there. So I suppose there was the ambiguous tendencies is what I'm now beginning to see most often reflected in Lovecraft's later work.
Is it also, to a certain extent, like Poe's influence maybe waning, because Poe has that sort of that motif of the story starting with somebody who is sort of recovering or failing to recover. They're trying to recuperate, they maybe hours from death, and they're recollecting the whole story in a sort of a delirium, which Lovecraft uses quite a lot in the early stories.
He does, that's right. In fact, you could argue that there are a lot of correspondences between the Rat and the Walls of the Fall of the House of Usher, I think, particularly the sense of the house being also, the ancestry of the house in that sense. That certainly occurs in Burroughs.
You said about a story that you'd written.
Yeah.
You shouldn't. You shouldn't have done.
Yes.
You said you'd really
Lovecraftian adjectives.
Okay, I've done this often enough, so I hope the people here have not heard me do it, or who, if they have heard me do it, will probably now want to get up and leave rapidly before I start. What this was, you see, this was, I was 14 years old, I think, when I began, 14 when I began imitating Lovecraft. Initially just for my own amusement, because I'd become absolutely enamoured with his work. I read the first ever British paperback of Lovecraft. It was published here in 1960, and I read it from cover to cover in a day. I'd already been imitating other writers, but I knew this is my focus, this is what I wanted to do. And as I said, it's very easy to imitate what you perceive as Lovecraft, which is these, the key adjectives like eldritch and unspeakable and so forth. And perhaps I need to cover the microphone because I get pretty loud doing this one. What this is it's one of my earliest stories, and August Derth, who was Lovecraft's publisher, ran Arkham House in America, and who ultimately published my first book, was my first editor. I was very lucky indeed at the age of 15 to get an editor who would tell me what to do and what not to do, more particularly. So, without further ado, this is one of the things you tell me not to do, and you will understand that it's many of the things all wrapped into one package. You tell me not to do, you'll understand why I do it. So I think I will cover this, otherwise I'll just blow out the microphone, or blow out the speakers. This was a telegram sent to the narrator of an early story of mine called The Tomb Herd. It's actually set in Lovecraft territory. I've never been further than Southport, actually, by Government Sharon, So it's Kingsport of this story. I revised it later, it became somewhere else in Britain. Anyway, the narrator comes upon a telegram that has been, the friend he is visiting has written. The friend has now disappeared for reasons that will be apparent. And he's left this, the pen trails off across the page, so the telegram was never sent. And the telegram, I think I can tell you this verbatim, goes like so. To Richard Dexter, remember this is the telegram, to Richard Dexter, come at once to Kingsport. You are needed urgently by me here as protection against agencies which may kill me or worse if you do not come immediately. Will explain as soon as you get here, ... But what is this that flops unspeakably down the corridor towards this room? It cannot be that abomination that I glimpse in the dripping vaults beneath the church in Asquith Place. Here shall we go out, Cthulhu We don't know what the post office will know.
Wow. Pulling into Liverpool Station, looking up at a great big wet, damp sandstone sides, which are covered in moss.
Oh, well.
That's very, very Lovecraftian.
Oh, well, I did that with pictures of the pool. Yeah, I used those, yeah. A later novel, not quite as overwritten, I hope.
Any other questions?
How was Lovecraft rescued from obscurity if he wasn't appreciated?
That's an interesting question. Well, okay, it was a gradual process. Initially it was Archivans. August Earth and Donald Wandrive were two of his correspondents. On the day Earth heard of Lovecraft's death, Lovecraft lived in Providence, Earth in Wisconsin, Earth basically went out and sat on the railway bridge or sat by the river, and tried to think how they should commemorate Lovecraft. Durst was already published as a mainstream writer by it was Simon Schuster, and Scribner's one of the two, anyway, New York. And he initially put together, he and Wandrive initially put together this huge fat volume of the best of Lovecraft called The Outsider and Others. Offered it to Durst publisher, who said, well, basically, we can't hand this. It's a big short story collection by a writer that almost nobody's ever heard of. And so Durst thought, okay, well, we'll create a publisher in order to publish it. So it was one of the very first examples of the small press that's become so important in this field. Archivans was for many, many years the leading publisher in the field, sadly now pretty well defunct. So that came out, did not do very well, sold a few hundred copies. In his lifetime, Lovecraft had hardly ever been anthologised, although actually Dashiell Hammett, he of the Maltese Falcon, did do one horror anthology in the mid-30s that used one Lovecraft story. But then a couple of American paperback editions appeared. There was a mainstream book called Best Supernatural Stories of HP Lovecraft, something like that, in the mid-40s. Golanx, who are still saying good old yellowback Golanx, who now did this edition of the Time Machine, they picked up Lovecraft in the early 50s. But still, it was a very slow process. It probably wasn't until the 70s that Lovecraft surfaced in paperback, but by now there was a certain amount of criticism, largely in the small press and the fan press, but people were beginning to look critically at his work and write actual exegeses of his work. Colin Wilson actually did a contentious piece in The Strength to Dream, his study of the imagination and literature, and he was then supposed to do a Lovecraftian book to prove he could do it by August Earth, actually. Very gradually, I suppose, I didn't really say very much about the Lovecraft mythos, which has become this enormous, top-heavy thing. Lovecraft only ever put it together in a deliberately allusive way, an elusive way, actually, in the sense it was always meant to imply and suggest more than ever showed. Then lots of, at least me, God help me, came along and started filling in the gaps with exactly what not to do, and explain far too much. And then, I suppose the whole explosion of horror fiction and fantasy in the post-Tolkien, or not post-Tolkien, but the Tolkien, Stephen King era, which came slightly later, all of a sudden lots of publishers wanted to publish Lovecraft. And More recently, we have the Penguin Modern Classics edition, with a corrected text with footnotes. We have the Library of America did an edition of Lovecraft, and also we have to say, of course, the cinema picked it up. Initially in the early 60s, Roger Corman made The Haunted Palace, which is based on Lovecraft, and then after that, well, a few years later, actually, films with Lovecraft's name above the title, or at least on the poster, started to appear. There was a whole Lovecraft film industry that's now with most of which are pretty terrible. There are a few very good ones. But he became critically accepted, basically. And also there's been a very considerable amount of academic writing on him over the past 10 to 15 years, I suppose. And so it was a very, very gradual process. And he went through a bit of almost being forgotten, well, not having been that remembered in the first place. And the word got out, really, as it tends to.
Would you say that when for me, I'm like a second generation of Lovecraft, came in when the role-playing game came out in about 80s?
Well, that certainly did, of course. I mean, there's many Lovecraftian role-playing games, yes.
So I remember nobody had heard of it at school.
Yeah.
A week later,
Yes.
everyone was Lovecraftian. So everyone's English essays were Eldritch.
Really? What's that quicker?
Yeah, so people, everybody played it. And then
Yes.
40,000 came out.
Sure. That's right. Those are still burgeoning as well, of course. Yeah.
I don't know if we have time, but I was going to ask you about the mythos because, as you say, he only sort of suggested it. Why do you think he always had it at the back of his mind? The same universe, the same world-building exercise, if you can call it that.
Well, only very gradually, wasn't it? I mean, when it only really begins to show up in stories like the core, I won't pronounce it again. Previous to that, we have the passing reference to the Necronomicon, which is his great forbidden book, of which half a dozen copies extant. Although once people started imitating it, there seemed to be thousands of every public library but it's because I think partly because he only ever put it together piecemeal, but also it was only really one of the many symbols he used to suggest the unknown, or indeed the unknowable, the thing that was larger than could actually be shown, not so much that it's unspeakable or indescribable, just too large to be contained within a narrative. And specifically, he was trying to move away from, I've said there's some morphologies, I will quote myself there. He was trying to move away from what he saw as the excessive codification of Victorian occultism, and also, the standard figures of supernatural literature. I mean, you did cite the ghost, of course, but there are a few ghosts in Lovecraft. I mean, even those are not really conventional ghosts anymore. They are in, say, M.R. James, where they're very unlikely to be just the returning dead in the usual sense. But I mean, Lovecraft, well, he just about wrote a vampire story, if you like, The Shunned House. But it most certainly is not any kind of vampire of the kind we would normally associate with that term. He actually wrote a narrative poem about a werewolf. That was the one really conventional trope he ever employed. But he really wanted to invent new things, basically to engage the imagination afresh. I think that's the mythos was. I don't think he ever really did have a fully developed sense of it, and I don't think he wanted that either. Although he did encourage his literary friends to add to it, but not to explain it. And suddenly, when I think it was really August Earth who, for all the good that he did as the publisher of Lovecraft, he did very much try and codify it and organise it in a way that never was meant to be organised in the first place.
It's like Marvel Comics with Avengers team-ups, trying to piece their things together.
Yeah, that really ought to be pieced together at all. Yeah. Well, I was so much about Marvel, but certainly with Lovecraft.
Any other questions?
Just going to ask please. We've got a science fiction writer writing about monstrous Martians and a horror writer writing about aliens. What's the sort of crossover of the two genres? Are they kind of exclusive or? do we find that people just pinch from each other's kind of area?
Is there a line? Is there a boundary, do you think?
Well, not necessarily boundary, is there?
No, it's a crossovers.
It's something to do with the rationale behind the horror that you see. So the Wells wrote what could be called horror, Orange tomorrow, and a particular example, and others as well. So no, I think it's the rationale beneath that counts.
I'm surprised that you even questioned Brian Aldiss calling Frankenstein a science fiction book, because to me it's a science fiction book. But do you regard it as a horror book? More?
Well, that's a different question really. That's about origins, you know. And I've never been very content with that. When you project modern definitions back into the past, there's another science fiction scholars, Andy Williams, talk about proto-science fiction, which seems more sensible to me.
Yeah.
It's stuff that led up to what was called science fiction from 1924 onwards, or whatever, in terms of even Wells' stuff. He called them scientific romances. So romantic got a slightly different, like tall story kind of aspect.
Yes.
But I think I would say Frankenstein in that tradition. She seems to be extrapolating from the galvanic experiments and so on. You know, a bit of electricity, the muscles twitch. So that's a classic bit of SF.
It is, and she specifically has in try alchemy and then move beyond it. That's a crucial detail.
So it is SF in that sense, but only in a retrospective sense. Brian always firmly states that as the start of SF. But I think there's a whole other tradition that ignores the travel literature. Robinson Crusoe, things like that, which clearly Robinson Crusoe, especially, I claim, is a kind of SF story. It's like The Martian. That's something like a track comparison, but you think about it at the time, the idea of having a man alone on an island was something that could only happen in the age of exploration. It couldn't have happened before because people were sailing around the world to these exotic places. So it's just as if now you have a man stranded on Mars alone. It couldn't happen. It's a situation that arises from changes of technology and so forth. But I think science fiction certainly can.
With Forbidden Planet, we've been able to retrospectively project science fiction back all the way to the Tempest.
Yes.
In a way, it's another exploration story. Well, my last question, I guess, has to be to you, Stephen, about the sequel. Am I allowed to ask a question? Do the Martians return?
Of course.
And is it? Can you talk about it at all?
I can.
What approach you've taken?
Well, I'm still working on it, so I'm always a bit nervous about who else does it. But I haven't. Right from the beginning, it's not steampunk, right? And there's no role for Dr. Moreau, and there's no Sherlock Holmes. I've been doing that since.
That narrows it down.
In fact, the first sequel to The War of the Worlds was published as The War of the Worlds. It's simply pirated in America. They changed all the names to Boston and so on. And this guy did a sequel in which Edison goes to Mars to go to Mars, as The War of the Worlds has been. So there's none of that stuff. Because, you look at it from my talk, I think it's going to be a piece of work. It predicted a lot of the horrors of the 20th century and warfare and so on. I think you've got to take it seriously in that regard. About 10 years ago or so, I did my own novel of the Second World War called Weaver, alternate history of since the Nazis invaded England. And so, researching, reading accounts of the Second World War, first-hand accounts, and I kept on coming across Wells' name in there. People would keep on saying it's just like something else of the Blitz, like something else of H.G. Wells, something else of H.G. Wells. So referring to books like The War of the Worlds. Because it was important, because somebody at least had been there imaginatively before it's the first. So I think a sequel's got to be a tribute to that. You've got to take it seriously. There are big tanks in it.
Fantastic. Well, it just remains for me to thank both of us tonight's guests. Please join me in thanking Stephen Baxter and